It's 7 p.m. now, so I'll just go ahead and start. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Aruba Asim, and I am the social media manager here at CLT. We also have a podcast Anchored, and so I co-host on the podcast, and I'm also the podcast producer. I wanted to talk a little bit about what CLT is. For those of you who don't know what CLT is an alternative to the SAT and ACT. And our goal really has been to put students in front of the best of what has been thought and said. The SAT and ACT, the material is usually, doesn't have anything to do with classical education, but also the fact that it's pretty mundane and it's not as interesting. And so we decided that we want to create a test where students can actually be engaged and have beautiful material put in front of them. And so one of the things that we have is our author bank. I'm going to do a screen share here. Okay, let's do this. So this is our website, cltexam.com. And then if you go to tests here and go down to author bank, you see that we have this great author bank with some great thinkers. And this is what makes up 2/3 of what we put in front of students on the CLT test. And so our goal with Journey Through the Author Bank is to go through this list of authors and really talk about them in depth. And so today we have Dr. Max Sandlin with us. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Sandlin. And he's going to be talking about J.R.R. Tolkien and his work and his life. And so we're going to get started very soon. At about 7:45 or whenever Dr. Sandlin finishes his presentation, we're going to have a 15-minute Q&A. So when you guys are, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat, and then we'll discuss those as well. So I'm going to stop screen sharing here. And Dr. Sandlin, whenever you're ready, you can begin your presentation.
PowerPoint stuff here. You guys can see this now? No problem? Very good. So one of the things that I wondered about when I was trying to put together a lecture for this particular audience, I know last week you guys had a great presentation on Dante. I watched that and enjoyed that very much, but I thought Dante might be something that I'd be surprised if the average high schooler had read through all of the Divine Comedy. But with Tolkien, my expectation is that most people who are tuning in for a lecture like this are pretty familiar with John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. You've read The Hobbit maybe in school, or Lord of the Rings, seen the movies, that sort of thing. Maybe you've even read the Silmarillion. So rather than just walking through the books and what they're about, which I assume you already know, I wanted to delve into one particular aspect of the books that I think is really fascinating. And so we'll look at Tolkien, we'll look at The Hobbit extensively, a little bit in Lord of the Rings, and a little bit at the end from the Silmarillion, to talk about the way that riddles function in his work. So like Ms. Asim said, I'm Max Sandlin. I teach at Harding University. I teach in the College of Bible and Ministry. I'm a theologian by training, but I also work in the Honors College and teach quite a few classes that work on the integration of theology and philosophy and literature. And I am, like many of you I see in the chat over here, just an absolute Tolkien nerd. I think I've read The Hobbit first in the 3rd grade and read it then once a year, every year until I was about 25 or so. Now I'm a father of 3. I read it with my kids. I've read Lord of the Rings probably 13, 15 times, Silmarillion 8 or 9 times, all the letters, the backgrounds, the stuff with Christopher Tolkien, just a hyper huge fan of the world and the work. But I'm also someone who's interested in poetry and in Anglo-Saxon history and medieval history and Roman Catholic theology. And Tolkien really is a person and an author who stands right at the middle of all those different worlds. So I want to look tonight at a couple of things dealing with riddles in Tolkien. So on your screen now, you can see a quotation from Scripture from the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament. This is the opening in which the wise King Solomon wants to pass along to his son instructions about how to grow in wisdom. And I want you to notice what he says. He says, to know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing and righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the simple. Prudence is a word that means the ability to see good from evil, to discern. Knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance. To understand a proverb and a saying, and then notice the last line, the words of the wise and their riddles. This is a passage that Tolkien would certainly have been very familiar with, given his own deep religiosity and his deep commitment to Christian ideals, his Roman Catholic faith, and to Scripture. And I can just imagine this last line, the words of the wise and their riddles. It sounds like something right out of Lord of the Rings, something that Gandalf would say to Saruman or Saruman to Gandalf. So that's what we want to look at tonight. We want to look at the words of the wise and their riddles as they appear in Tolkien. Being a theologian, I'll sometimes make connections to that field as well. Not simply because it's my interest, but because it was an interest of Tolkien's as well, and because it's a pervasive sort of theme throughout all of his works. So when we talk about riddles in Lord of the Rings, the first thing that we probably think about is the famous chapter from The Hobbit, where we find Bilbo down in the depths. And so I want to just read you a little bit from this very beautiful copy. I'm very proud of my copy of The Hobbit, Houghton Mifflin Publishing. And this is the famous chapter 5, Riddles in the Dark, where Bilbo and Gollum meet up down in the depths under the Misty Mountains. And Gollum can't decide whether to eat Bilbo or to sort of chat with him. He does get lonely. Bilbo can't decide whether to stab this nasty creature or to see if he can tell him the way out. And so they fall into this riddle game. And this is the game that Tolkien would know very well because it was very, very popular in Anglo-Saxon world. And Tolkien, of course, was an expert on medieval and Anglo-Saxon literature, a professor of philology, that is the study of the history of words. And so I want to look at these various riddles. Now, all of these riddles in the text, Tolkien himself wrote and made up, though some of them are adaptations from classic riddles from the Anglo-Saxon literary corpus. So the wind riddle in particular is an adaptation of another riddle. There they are, Bilbo and Gollum, and Bilbo says, "You ask first," because he had not had time to think of a riddle. And so Gollum hissed, "What has roots that nobody sees, is taller than trees, up it goes, and yet never grows." Now, if I were a really good lecturer, I would do a cool Gollum voice in this bit, and I would say, "Precious." But I'll just read it in a normal kind of Southern American accent, as I naturally have. Well, Gollum asked about this, roots that nobody sees. Incidentally, this is taken from the idea that mountains have roots, shows up in Norse mythology. When the Viking gods are going to bind the great wolf Fenris with a chain, Gleipnir is called, the chain is made in part from the roots of mountains, and that is a number of invisible things. Also, the sound a cat makes when it walks, the shape of the wind, things like this. So Gollum says to Bilbo, "What has roots that nobody sees, is taller than trees, up it goes, and yet never grows?" Well, Bilbo answers it quickly. "Mountain, I suppose," he says, and even has a rhyme in his answer. And then Bilbo asks the responding riddle. 30 white horses on a red hill, first they champ, then they stamp, then they stand still. Notice here, Gollum is asking about the mountain, the world in which he lives. But when he asks about the mountain, he's talking, the beginning, the open is, what has roots that nobody sees? He's down in the darkness and he's asking about the mountain. Bilbo, on the other hand, listen to the sound of his riddle. 30 white horses on a red hill. First they champ, then they stamp, then they stand still. Some have suspected that Tolkien may be playing upon the traditional heraldry of his own region there in England. But nevertheless, white horses, a red hill, you can picture them out in the sunshine, whereas Gollum's riddle are down underground. Well, this is all that Bilbo could think of to ask. Tolkien says he was thinking about eating, precisely because Bilbo, if you've read The Hobbit, is always thinking about eating. Bacon and eggs pervasive throughout the text. But in this case, he's thinking about eating because Gollum is thinking about gobbling him up. And so he thinks of this riddle, but it's an old riddle. And Tolkien, I always felt bad as a kid because Tolkien says it was rather an old one too. And Gollum knew the answer as well as you do. And I remember being a child and reading that and thinking, oh no, I don't know the answer at all. These easy riddles are hard for me. But Gollum says, teeth, teeth, my precious, but we only have 6. Gollum only has 6 teeth. The white horses are our white teeth, a red hill, the gums, they champ, they stamp, they stand still when you're finished chewing. Go back to Gollum, his next riddle, the one that I said is adapted from an Anglo-Saxon riddle. Voiceless it cries, wingless flutters, toothless bites, mouthless mutters. The answer, of course, is the wind. Notice also when Tolkien writes the lyrics of this, because these riddles are very much like songs, when he writes the words, look at how many S's show up there on your screen. Voiceless, it cries, wingless, flutters. All of this is in part because, of course, Gollum is always hissing and sissing and saying s, but also because when you want to make the sound of the wind, you say s, the wind blows around. This is the sound that the S makes is a very windy, airy sort of sound. And so the form of the poem that Tolkien writes mirrors the answer. Wonderful stuff. Also notice how, when you think of the wind, do you think of it as crying, biting, muttering? These are all nasty, negative things that it might do, dark. And so it fits that Gollum would see the wind this way. He doesn't see it as like wind in our hair or wind at our backs or sails full of wind. This is a voiceless cry, a wingless, like a bird hopping around injured, a wingless flutter, a toothless bite. Gollum says, I only have 6 teeth. And so he has a sort of toothless bite himself. Mouthless, it's muttering. And Tolkien frequently used the word mutter to describe Gollum's speech. Bilbo guesses the answer, though he has to say half a moment. And then he says, this'll puzzle the nasty little underground creature. And he asks this riddle. An eye in a blue face saw an eye in a green face. That eye is like to this eye, said the first eye, but in low place, not in high place. This is one that I also remember as a kid having no idea what it meant. And then Gollum says, he'd been underground a long, long time and was forgetting this sort of thing. But just as Bilbo was beginning to hope that the wretch would not be able to answer, Gollum brought up memories of ages and ages and ages before when he lived with his grandmother in a hole in a bank by the river. My precious, he says. Sun on the daisies, it means. I remember reading this as a kid and thinking, sun on the daisies? I still have no idea what the riddle is saying. So let's see if we can unpack it in case you're quite as dense as a young Mac was. An eye in a blue face. Okay. The blue face is the sky. The sun is the yellow eye. Saw an eye in a green face. The green face is the meadow. The eye down below, a yellow eye down below, is the daisies. That eye, though it is the one on the ground, is like to this eye. That is, it's both yellow. Said the first eye, that is, the sun is speaking. But it's in a low place, not in a high place. It's down on the ground. It's not up in the sky. Gollum does eventually figure it out. He asks again, it cannot be seen, cannot be felt, cannot be heard, cannot be smelt. Notice all the hiding language here. It lies behind stars and under hills, and empty holes it fills. It comes first and follows after, ends life, kills laughter. Again, dark, ominous, brooding, threatening. And so this might be a very tough riddle. It's one of my favorites in the riddle contest. But of course, Bilbo had heard this sort of thing before, he says, and the answer was all round him anyway. Dark, he said, without even scratching his head or putting on his thinking cap. The answer is the darkness. We might wonder all sort of fun little things once you know the answer to look back and say, can you see the dark? We talk about feeling the darkness, especially Tolkien will talk about a darkness that is almost thick. He'll use these tactile sort of words to describe darkness in Lord of the Rings, in the lair of Shelob, for example, or in Silmarillion when he's talking about Melkor or Morgoth and the thick darkness that surrounds him. So it can almost be felt. He goes on like this, but Gollum's poems, Gollum's riddles continue to be dark riddles. So then Bilbo asked in response, and this was always my favorite when I was a kid. I just loved this one. I thought it was really charming and clever. A box without hinges, key, or lid, yet golden treasure inside is hid. Bilbo is off on an adventure. Bilbo is seeking treasure. He's seeking dragon gold. He's thinking about a treasure chest. And yet this is a very hobbitish sort of riddle. What is the treasure that Bilbo himself longs for the most? Eggs and bacon. And so Gollum has, again, a very hard time remembering it, but he remembers eventually. He says, give us a chance, give us a chance. And then it says, suddenly Gollum remembered thieving from nests long ago. Notice that Gollum doesn't even say like gathering eggs. He's thieving eggs from long ago, sitting on the riverbank and teaching his grandmother to suck, not scramble or fry or boil, but to suck. Eggs, he hissed. Eggs it is. And so it's an egg, right? I sometimes, even today when I'm cooking, I'll crack the egg and I'll think about this riddle about the shell as a box, a little box holding the golden treasure. Of course, the best part of the egg is the yolk. It's only good, healthy people who want to have the whites. All right, just a few more riddles. The next one, Gollum says, alive without breath, as cold as death, never thirsty, ever drinking, all in mail, never clinking. Wonderful riddle here. And this one is very easy for Gollum because, of course, he eats these things all the time. Bilbo has to think about it. And by luck, Bilbo has an unusual share of luck. We might say he has providential blessing, that is, that God looks out for him. A fish splashes up near the edge of the pool, and Bilbo says, oh, yes, it's a fish. It's a fish. Well, Gollum's disappointed. By this time, he's thinking about eating as well. He's been getting out of his boats to try and eat Bilbo up. Bilbo has fish on the brain, and so he also offers a fish riddle. No legs lay on one leg. 2 legs sat near on 3 legs. 4 legs got some. This is generally people's least favorite of the riddles in the contest. No legs, that gives it away. That's a fish. We've just been talking about fish. 1 leg, this is a pedestal. This is the pedestal table, right? 2 legs, that's a human. Sat near on 3 legs, the stool. 4 legs got some. Cat gets the bones. So Gollum guesses it pretty quickly, and he says, fish on a table, man at the table sitting on a stool, cat has the bones. Bilbo's seen, though, contrast again. For Gollum, a fish is almost like a zombie. Breath and cold, drinking without being thirsty, silently gliding around, though in a suit of armor. For Bilbo, fish is something, it's a homey, it's a domestic scene, a man sitting at a table eating fish and tossing bones down to his cat. And of course, this comes to the last and greatest of Gollum's riddles, the riddle that names the scariest and most dreadful of all the things that he names. Especially if you're a reader of Tolkien's work, you know that time is the thing which the Númenóreans, Aragorn's old people, the men of old feared because time meant death. And so Gollum's last riddle is, this thing all things devours, birds, beasts, trees, flowers, gnaws iron, bites steel, and grinds hard stones to meal, slays kings, ruins town, and beats high mountain down. Bilbo can't figure it out at all. He's saved by pure luck when he can't guess it. And he says, he means to say, give me a little more time. And instead he just squeaks, time, time. And of course, this is the answer. Then there's a sudden shift because Bilbo asks a riddle, which is not really a riddle at all. And, but it fits with what he's doing. Very prosaic, very common. He puts his hand in his pocket, trying to think of what to do. He bumps up against the gold ring that he discovered up in the passage, and he asks Gollum, what have I got in my pocket? Notice the move from the infinite right? Power of time to now something very normal, very hobbity. What have I got in my pocket? And of course, Gollum gets, 3 guesses at it. He can't guess it, though I like the scene where he almost gets it by saying hands, and Bilbo snatches his hands out of his pockets just in time, and so he's saved. All right, so this is the scene where we think about riddles showing up in The Lord of the Rings and in The Hobbit and in the Silmarillion. This is the most explicit riddling scene. Though, if you flip backwards a little bit in the book, when Gandalf first shows up in chapter 1, An Unexpected Party, Gandalf comes along and Bilbo sees him. Let me read you this other little riddle that Bilbo and Gandalf have a bit of a riddling game, though on accident. "Good morning," said Bilbo, and he meant it. The sun was shining, the grass was very green, but Gandalf looked at him from under long, bushy eyebrows that stuck out further than the brim of his shady hat. This is something they did not do in the movies. The eyebrows are thick, but they're not this thick, right? But Gandalf has exceptional eyebrows here in this. If you know the theologian Rowan Williams, I always think of his eyebrows in this scene. "What do you mean?" said Gandalf. "Do you wish me a good morning? Or do you mean that it's a morning that is good whether I want it or not? Or that you feel good on this morning? Or that it is a morning to be good on?" That is, Bilbo says something simple, "Good morning." And Gandalf says, "Are we playing a riddling game? What do you mean by good morning?" And then he proceeds to give 6 or 7 different answers that are possible. Bilbo is flummoxed and he says, "All of them at once, and a very fine morning for a pipe of tobacco out of doors into the bargain. If you have a pipe about you, sit down and join me." Bilbo's answer is interesting. He says, "Good morning." Gandalf says, "What do you mean by good morning?" That is, let's answer this riddle. And Bilbo's answer is not one thing, but rather he says, all of them at once and something more. The reader who's read the book before knows this is a particularly good morning, because this morning is the morning that will set Bilbo on his path that will make his future, that will make him a great adventurer, that will make him rich, that will make his fame and fortune and all this. And so the riddles that show up in the text are not always given as a riddle. You might also think about a famous scene. We'll talk about this some more in a minute. In the big red book, The Lord of the Rings, when they come to the Mines of Moria, the chapter is called A Journey in the Dark. And as they come to the Mines of Moria and they want to get in, you get 2 wonderful illustrations, one of which is this famous illustration that Tolkien gives us of the Gates of Moria, and the inscription upon it that says, "Speak, friend, and enter." Gandalf has to try and figure out how to get in, right? And he says, "I'll figure it out. Just give me a little time." And they say, "Well, how are you going to get in?" Great scene here in the book. I want to read this to you. He says, "What are you going to do then?" asked Pippin, undaunted by the wizard's bristling brows. "Knock on the doors with your head, Peregrine Took," said Gandalf. "But if that does not shadow them, and I'm allowed a little peace from foolish questions, I will seek the opening words. I once knew every spell in all the tongues of elves or men or orcs that was ever used for such a purpose. I can still remember 10 score of them without searching my mind, but only a few trials I think will be needed, and I shall not have to call on Gimli for words of the secret dwarf tongue that they teach to none. The opening words were elvish, like the writing on the arch. That seems certain." He goes up, he tries a few elvish words. The lines faded, but the blank stone did not stir. Many times he repeated these words in different order or varied them. Then he tried other spells, one after another, speaking now faster and louder, now soft and slow. Then he spoke many single words of elvish speech. Nothing happened. Gandalf, surprisingly, is stumped. The cliff towered into the night. The cloudless stars were kindled. The wind blew cold, and the doors stood fast. Again, Gandalf approached the wall. Lifting up his arms, he spoke in tones of command and rising wrath. "Edro, Edro," he cried, and struck the rock with his staff. "Open, open," he shouted, and followed it with the same command in every language that had ever been spoken in the west of Middle-earth. Then he threw his staff on the ground and sat down in silence. And he's horribly frustrated. Anybody who likes riddles and has played riddle games or read riddles has had this experience, right? You first have confidence. I got this. I can figure this out. You look into it longer. You think, I'll try this. No, that can't be it. No, that can't be it. Then you begin to just scream and shout. You throw down your staff and you sit down in silence, grumpily. Gandalf is quite grumpy. They go on for a while. They're getting nervous. And then with a suddenness that startled them all, the wizard sprang to his feet. He was laughing. Gandalf is a grumpy character in the books. And so when he laughs, it's always kind of a nice moment. He's laughing. I have it, he cried. Of course, absurdly simple, like most riddles when you see the answer. Notice that Gandalf here names it as a riddle and says it is absurdly simple, like most riddles when you have the answer. It's like when you're playing Trivial Pursuit with your friends or Quiz Bowl, and it's not your turn, but you know the answer, and you go, oh, so easy. And I always want to say, they're all easy once you know them. Gandalf says, absurdly simple once you know the answer. Picking up his staff, he stood before the rock and said in a clear voice, Melon, which is, of course, the Elvish word for friend. Speak, friend, and enter, the text says. Gandalf does it. All right, so we've looked at some riddles in the book. I want to talk a little bit about how riddles work. And to do this, I want to give you just a few points about riddles. You can see on your screen a very famous picture. Comes from a philosopher named Ludwig Wittgenstein. Probably all you high school students are getting up early in the morning in your classical education or your homeschool education, and you're reading Philosophical Investigations by Wittgenstein. And so you already know this picture, the duck rabbit. If you look at it, you can see from one perspective, it's a duck. From another, it's a rabbit. And here's a fun little activity. Go ahead and look at it and look at the rabbit. You see it? Okay. Now look at the duck. Do you see the duck? Good. Now try and do this for me. And everybody, if you want to just play along here, this is nice. They can see your face. And so when you have it, give me a thumbs up. You can see the duck? And you
yes, I can see the duck. Yeah.
All right.
And
now,
the rabbit. Yeah.
Try and see them both at the same time. It's tricky, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it turns out, thanks for helping out. It turns out it's actually kind of impossible to see them both at the same time. If you think you're doing it, and I always have students when I teach this in class, they always say, I've got it. I can see them both at the same time. But neurologically, it's actually not quite possible. Your brain has a certain pathway that goes rabbit and another pathway that goes duck. And so if you think you see them at the same time, probably what you're doing is seeing duck, rabbit, very, very quickly and switching it back and forth, and you think you see it. The other option is you do what's called create a tertium quid. That's Latin for a third thing. Neither duck nor rabbit, but something called duck rabbit. And I can kind of do this if I focus on just the eyeball and sort of cross my eyes a little bit. I can see duck rabbit, but it's not a duck or a rabbit. So I'm not seeing them both. I'm seeing some tertium quid, some third thing. What we call it when your brain switches from rabbit to duck or back and forth is a Gestalt switch. And so riddling involves a Gestalt switch. Tolkien describes Gandalf as looking at the riddle on the door and thinking that the riddle is saying, my friend, speak the password and enter. And Gandalf begins to try and speak passwords. And it's not until his brain says, click, Eureka, I found it. I have it, he says. He actually says, Eureka, I have it. That is, his brain has switched. Absurdly simple. The text actually says, speak, comma, quotation mark, friend, and enter. It's the Elvish word for friend. He makes the Gestalt switch just like you make the switch from rabbit to duck or duck to rabbit. Now, let me show you this next picture that slightly more interesting. Now, when you look at this, Aruba, go ahead and unmute. Tell me what you see when you look at this.
See a cube.
Very good. Of course you see a cube. Interesting sociological experiment, anthropological experiment that was done with this. This is called a Necker cube. You can probably remember learning to draw these when you were in, second or third grade. You draw a square, then another square behind it and connect it. You can remember doing this. If I were to give you guys pieces of wire and say, please construct this shape, you would take the wire and you would make a cube from it. But some anthropologists went to a particular tribe in Africa and they gave them wire and they showed them a picture like this and they said, make this. And do you know what they did? They laid the wire down flat on the ground to make this shape. That is, they made a two-dimensional shape just like this. And when the anthropologists tried to get them to see, no, it's a box. It was very hard for them to see it as a box. Just the same way that for you, it's very hard for you guys, especially if I assume you're all watching from somewhere in the West, America or England, something like this. It's very hard for Westerners to look at this and not see a box. Try and look at it as a two-dimensional object. It's really difficult. It's hard to kind of flatten it out and see it, because when we go around driving around, what we see all the time, American architecture, God help us, it's not particularly lovely. It's a bunch of boxes, and we're surrounded by boxes. When we want to make a book, we don't have a scroll. We have a little box, right, that we put together. So this Gestalt switch, right, from flat to three-dimensional, same sort of thing that happens with the duck rabbit happens here. Okay, all right. So the first thing, riddles involve a Gestalt switch. Number two, riddles demand, and I think this is an interesting sort of point, riddles demand humility. Riddling is not the sort of thing where you can have a ton of confidence coming into it. They reward the one who comes seeking a gift. So when Gandalf comes to the mines of Moria, and he wants to say, I know every password in the language of orcs and elves and men, right? He doesn't get it. It's not until he sits and waits and then recognizes, oh, I'm like a child here. So famous quote from the text, Gandalf says, some believe that it's only great power that can hold evil in check, but that is not what I have found. I have found that it is the small everyday deeds of ordinary folk that keep the darkness at bay, small acts of kindness and love. The great riddle in The Lord of the Rings is power and the riddle of power. And those who are wise know that power is found amongst humility, in giving oneself. Very Christian theme that Tolkien is looking into. Almost every character in Lord of the Rings who we're meant to see as heroic dies and rises again. Frodo does it twice. Once on Weathertop when the Nazgûl strike him, again with Shelob later, and then again too when he gets on the boat to go to the Grey Havens. Gandalf does it famously in the Mines of Moria. But riddles in general are this way. Riddles come all of a sudden as a gift. It's a funny thing. When you try to learn to ride your bike, you start out and you're no good at riding your bike. Then you're a little better, then you're pretty good, then you're proficient. But that's not how you figure out the answer to a riddle, is it? Think about, here's a riddle that you may probably have not heard before, because it is the oldest riddle that we have in the world. It comes from ancient Sumeria, several thousand years old, and it goes like this. There is a house that one enters blind, but comes out seeing. What is it? Well, you begin to think about it, and it becomes pretty difficult. I don't know. What is a house that you enter blind, but come out seeing? Maybe you think, oh, I know what it is. It's an ophthalmological hospital. I see that someone in the, looks like in the chat over here is guessing that it's the ophthalmological hospital. But of course, that's not quite it. So what could it be? What is this thing? Well, they didn't have ophthalmological hospitals back in ancient Sumeria. So the answer is, I see some people are guessing. Aha, someone has it. H. Bell has it. It's a school. That's exactly right. And we certainly hope that you thought about it and humbly the answer just came to you, as opposed to Googling it, which would be terrible, terrible thing to do, and then pretending to know the answer. So yeah, a school is the right answer. They did have schools, and they said you come into a school blind, but you come out seeing. Matter of fact, that's what schools are even still today. One of the things that we try and teach is how to see. The interesting thing about it is when the riddle, the answer comes to you when you see it. When we said, is it a cave? A cave is dark. You go in blind, but I guess you come out in the sunlight and you can kind of see that. That seems right. But I noticed that when Olivia Fitch wrote a school, she did something wonderful. If you look at the chat, you can see this. The early answers, the hospital, question mark. Wisdom, question mark. A cave, question mark. A school, and then after that had been said, Olivia says, a school, exclamation point. That is, when the answer comes, it comes as in a flash. There I have it. Famous philosopher named Cora Diamond has a wonderful essay about riddles in which she looks at the riddle of the Sphinx. Riddle of the Sphinx is famous. You may know it from Percy Jackson books or mythology or whatever. What goes on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, 3 legs in the evening? And it's right, a human crawls as a baby, walks as an adult, has a cane as an old person. It's exactly right. The aha moment comes when you see it. The interesting thing about riddles is when you try and figure out the answer, you usually do kind of a trial and error guess, right? Could it be a cave? Could it be this? What could be the answer to the Sphinx's riddle? A centipede? Oh, he's got too many legs at every time of day. Couldn't be him. But the very same process of thinking that makes you think it can't be a centipede also makes you think can't be a person. They only have 2 legs, morning, noon, and night. And yet, once you think of person and you see it, there's this aha, this eureka, this I found it. The answer to riddles comes as a gift, as a grace. It comes out of nowhere like a flash. That's how Gandalf is. And that's why when it comes, Gandalf laughs. And it's interesting to think, at whom is he laughing? Oh, he's laughing at himself. Here I was, the big, powerful, all-knowing wizard, but really what was needed was just a friend. And he remembers. Okay, so riddles require a Gestalt switch. They demand humility. They demand attentiveness. A little shorter on this one. I am trying to watch our time, so I have time for Q&A. Remember that when Bilbo asks riddles, what sort of things does he ask about? He asks about daytime things. He asks about above ground things. He asks about domestic things. He asks about things having to do with food, but the sort of food that a hobbit would cook and eat in his own kitchen. Whereas Gollum asks about what sort of things? Dark things, secret things, hiding things, thieving things, deadly things. Each one asked riddles out of his own experience. I had a friend named Lucas when I was at the University of Dayton doing my Ph.D. And Lucas was very, very good at riddles, very good at riddles. And I couldn't figure out why. I studied riddles, but he was good at riddles. And part of the answer turned out to be Lucas was interested in everything. He read all sorts of books. He liked science. He liked zoos. He liked botany. He liked poetry. He liked everything I liked and everything else. And it was this wide attentiveness that let him understand quickly what things were. Remember that it's Gollum's memory, right? Of, oh yes, I remember eggs. I can remember, even though it pains me, sun on the daisies and such. Lots of times riddles are a way of saying, hey, did you notice? Which is the same sort of thing. Incidentally, there's some fun work to be done between riddles on the one hand and humor on the other. So Jerry Seinfeld, famous 1990s, early 2000s comedian, what he made very famous was a kind of comedy that was all about, hey, did you ever notice? And then he would say something. And the humor in his bits was, oh, I had seen that 100 times, but I'd never noticed it. I'd not been attentive to it. So when you want to get good at riddles, it demands attentiveness. If we were to go back to the book of Proverbs as an example of this, notice how often Solomon or the author, the various people write Proverbs in the book of Proverbs. Notice how often the various authors will allude to things in the world around them, right? They'll say things like, go to the ant, you sluggard. And you can picture the wise King Solomon looking closely at ants, watching them work. Look how they go, paying attention to things. So the braggart, the fool, the one who's wise in his own eyes, doesn't look around at anything in the world and pay attention because he thinks, I've already got all the answers. But wisdom, the one who can see, who can grow in wisdom, is the one who says, I'm interested in everything. I don't know everything. I want to know everything. And so you can see how Tolkien, who is a university professor, is also talking about wisdom, about education, about how to grow in knowledge. All right, next point. Riddles demand an essential, a knowledge of essential narrative backgrounds. That is, you can hear riddles all day long, but if you don't know the essential narrative backgrounds, you won't get them. So think about if we go back to our duck rabbit picture. You can look at it, and if you saw the rabbit but you couldn't see the duck, your friend might go, oh, look over here, this bit's the bill. And you'd say, oh, okay, now I see it. But what if you'd never seen a duck before? Think about our friends in Africa who lived in a tribal village where they didn't build everything out of cubes. They weren't surrounded by boxes. They tended to make pottery. Their houses were round, made of mud packed together. They didn't encounter boxes, and so when they saw the Necker cube, they saw a flat shape because that wasn't part of their world. Sometimes it's not just attentiveness to things around us, it's also stories that matter. So I wanted to read you at least one riddle today from what's called the Exeter book. The Exeter book is one of the oldest pieces of literature we have in the English language. I'll read it to you in modern English, though it's written in Old English, like Beowulf or something. Tolkien would have known the Exeter book very well. And it's a fun activity to go back. You can go online and read these things, the Exeter book Riddles. It's a religious book, but it has just a bunch of fun riddles that these ancient Anglo-Saxon people had. So I'll ask the riddle. You'll have to listen carefully because I didn't write this one down for you, but listen. And if you think you have the answer, put it in the chat, okay? All right, here it goes. A man sat at his wine with his 2 wives and his 2 sons and his 2 daughters, these beloved sisters. And each daughter had their 2 sons, goodly firstborn each. The father of each of these noble sons was there, and also an uncle and a nephew of each. 5 people all together, men and women sitting together. What is the man's name? Now, this is a tricky riddle. Some of you hear it and you know about riddles, and so you think, aha, I've got this one. I know the old riddle that goes, 2 fathers and 2 sons went fishing. Each man caught a fish. Only 3 fish were caught. How was it? Now, someone probably does know that when they're probably desperately typing it in the chat now to say, oh, it was a grandfather and a father and a son, 3 men, but the father in the middle is the son of the grandfather and the father of the son. So there are 2 fathers and 2 sons because there are multiple relations going on, right? So this is obviously a more complex version of one of these multiple relations riddles, but it's a tricky version of it because it doesn't just say, what are the relations? If I gave you more time, what you would do is you begin to puzzle it out. 1 man, 2 sons, 2 daughters, their 2 sons, the father of each son, an uncle and nephew of each son, that's 2 more, right? And the grandfather of each son. So it's like 15 people. And you begin to think, how can we get this many relations going on? And you'd think, okay, there's some sort of multiple relations going on here. And then, and I don't mean to distress anyone, it's kind of a distressing story. But what happened is you have a man who has married 2 of his daughters. And each of those daughters has given birth to a son. And so he is both the father and mother of the boys. Each boy is an uncle and a nephew of his brother. Each daughter is also a mother and a wife. And so this is how you get it. So you could do all of that work and you'd say, oh my goodness, it's this gross, incestuous story about a man who has sons by his 2 daughters and they're all sitting together. But the one who knows, yeah, like Oedipus, that's right. But this story actually is older than Oedipus. It is a Bible reference. That's right. It's a lot like Lot. You've got it. Now the people are catching it. And then you notice that there's one word in the riddle that gives away that it's Lot. And it's right at the beginning where it says, he sat at his wine. And this is the story of Abraham's nephew Lot, whose daughters wanted to get children by him. And so they got him drunk and had sex with their father, got children by him. And this is all in the book of Genesis in the Bible. But if you didn't know the story of Lot, let's imagine maybe somebody on here doesn't know that story. They haven't read the book of Genesis, or they've only read it in sort of like Sunday school appropriate ways where you skip over these very distressing stories in the Bible. And they say, well, I don't know the story of Lot, so I could never guess the man's name, right? I could never guess his name because I don't know the relevant background, narrative background. Gandalf in Lord of the Rings figures out the riddle on the doors of Moria because he remembers elves and dwarves used to be friends. The passcode was simple because they expect people to come in and out. Because he knows the history, he can solve the riddle. Last point is this. Riddles are characterized by iterative solutions. Iterative is a term that comes if you do computer programming. This is the basis for algorithms. It is you arrive at one thing and then you spiral down into the next thing. So it's spiraling, but not like this, rather like this, a sort of tunneling spiral like you see on your picture here, where one insight leads into a deeper insight and a deeper insight and a deeper insight. And Tolkien doesn't have this happen very often in his stories. When you read The Hobbit, Bilbo guesses Gollum's riddle, and that's it, right? You move on. I know what it is. It's a fish. Now we're on. But in Tolkien's first work, in his probably his favorite work, the Silmarillion, I'm flashing all my lovely copies of these books. It's not worth owning the books if you can't have really pretty copies of them. This is the Silmarillion. And I didn't mind doing spoilers in Lord of the Rings and Hobbit because I think most of you are familiar with those, but I won't do spoilers from Silmarillion in case you haven't read it yet. But I want you to hear how the book opens. The book opens with a creation account, like the Bible, except in this case, the sort of archangels are singing creation into existence. And so this is called the Annalindale. There was Eru, the one, who in Arda means the world, is called Iluvatar. This is God. This is God in Tolkien's world, Iluvatar. And he made first the Ainur, the holy ones that were the offspring of his thought. And they were with him before aught else was made. And he spoke to them, propounding to them great themes of music. And they sang before him, and he was glad. But for a long while they sang only each alone, or but a few together, while the rest hearkened. For each comprehended only that part of the mind of Iluvatar from which he came. And in the understanding of their brethren they grew but slowly. Yet ever as they listened, they came to deeper understanding and increased in unison and harmony. This is the opening scene. And his point is that first God reveals knowledge to them, and they think about it on their own. But as they listen to each other, notice the humility. They sit and they hearken, they listen, and they begin to see that which is true about them in another. And that which is true about their piece of the music echoed and adorned in the music of another. And thus they grow and they get better. Now, Tolkien goes on from there to talk about Melkor, the demon, the devil creature in his story, who comes along and stops listening, stops being humble, stops trying to go in the same pattern deeper and deeper, further up and further in, as Lewis would say in the Narnia books. And he begins to propound his own theme. And he is not humble. He is arrogant. And he does not listen. He does not attend to the others. He does not play the riddle game well. And thereby he becomes more and more foolish, less and less glorious, until at last Melkor, the mightiest of these archangels, these Ainur, the Valar, becomes the great enemy, the lowest of them, Morgoth, right? The super cursed, who is the bad guy who eventually gets Sauron and corrupts Sauron and gives birth to kind of the whole series. So we've seen these characteristics of riddles. We've looked at some riddles in The Hobbit, looked at some riddles in The Lord of the Rings, looked at even a kind of riddle in Silmarillion, all of which helps us see something interesting, I hope, about the books. I hope when you read Lord of the Rings or read The Hobbit or read Silmarillion, you'll have eyes to see these riddles, right? And think about riddles not just when they're explicit, like in chapter 5 of The Hobbit, but when they show up in all sorts of places. What's going on in the Palantir? Why can't Sauron guess that they want to destroy the ring? So forth and so on. Also, the most famous riddle in the internet that people can't figure out. Why didn't they just ride the eagles all the way to Mordor? Right? When you read Tolkien enough, you begin to see, oh, that's not part of the pattern. You're trying to step out. But I also think that what Tolkien is doing, because he's an educator, is trying to train his readers to say, this is what wisdom is like. This is what learning is like. And so if I'm speaking to folks who are looking to take a classical learning test, who are trying to form their education, whether in homeschool or classical school or private school or whatever it is, trying to be formed in their education to grow in wisdom, to see more clearly, that Tolkien wants to shape you on this. And he wants to say things like, read widely, study foreign languages, look at philosophy, pay attention to the natural sciences, gather everything in, have a humble attitude, not an attitude that says, I know everything, I've got all the answers, I've mastered it, but one that says, like Gandalf, right? Looking around, not trying to break the world to understand it, but attending to it. This is what we see in Tolkien. It's what we see in the scriptures that Tolkien loved and that helped to inspire his work. And it's what we see in the best examples of philosophy. So that's kind of the end of the lecture, but I'm happy to take questions at the end or do whatever Aruba thinks we should do next.
Yes, so there is a question for you here from Michael. He says that I've read a lot of Tolkien's work and I've noticed that Christian redemption does not seem to be a huge theme. Can you comment on this?
Yeah, you're exactly right that redemption is sort of like waiting. And there's reasons for this. So lots of interesting things about religion in Tolkien. Here's one. Nobody ever goes to church. The gods in Lord of the Rings, the Valar, these archangels, are barely mentioned. You know, when Frodo will say, "I, Elbereth," right? This is a reference to one of the Valar. But the theme of redemption is not mentioned exclusively, but it is there implicitly. So, for example, Gandalf gives his life at the Bridge of Moria to save the Fellowship and then rises up again, right? Frodo, who is wounded and bears this wound. Because he bears this wound, he is the savior of the world, and yet he is also not really one who fits in the world anymore and has to go on to the Grey Havens. Aragorn renounces his kingship and goes as the king in disguise for many years until at last, right, by the sacrificial redemption, he's brought to his kingdom, and then he puts his crown on and takes on his place. Even Gollum, the nastiest creature in the book and the most complex and interesting character in the novel, even Gollum is redeemed through his sort of providential self-sacrifice. Gollum himself does not want to, he doesn't lay down his life as Sam does for Frodo, as Gandalf does for the Fellowship, but providentially through luck. Luck plays a fascinating role in Tolkien, and I really think providence is a much better way of thinking about it. The Eagles certainly function in this way. The Eagles are the redemption that comes in at the last minute. And it's what Tolkien calls eucatastrophe, or the reverse catastrophe, the happy catastrophe that happens, this unbelievable surprise, such that when you read it, we critique it. We go, this is a deus ex machina, that is God from the sheen. You know, he just cheated to help him win. The Eagles come and save everybody. But for Tolkien, it's not a deus ex machina. It's a deus ex deus. It's God from God. The Eagles are the servants of Manwë, the chief of the Valar. He is the highest angel who serves God. So redemption, I think it does happen, but it's subtle. And part of this is because Tolkien doesn't want to have a single Jesus figure in his books. He dislikes allegory. And so you have these Christ figures, prophet, priest, king, that show up in Gandalf, Aragorn, Frodo, but always subtle. And this is one reason I like the Narnia books, but I think Tolkien's much more interesting because the redemptive themes are woven subtly throughout rather than being right on the surface.
That's great. And then if you could actually talk about your work at Harding U. So as you said, already mentioned that you're an assistant professor of theology and ethics there. And then if you could talk about the honors college as well, that would be great.
Absolutely. So I teach here at Harding. Harding is located in central Arkansas, a small private school associated with Churches of Christ, but open, of course, to all kinds of people. We have folks from all different religious backgrounds here. It's a small town that we live in here in Searcy, Arkansas, but we are a school that draws from all over the world. 50 states, 57 this year, foreign countries represented on campus. And so I teach freshman New Testament, sophomore Old Testament, junior level ethics, senior level. I teach seminar courses in the Holy Spirit, and I teach senior level seminar courses for the Honors College on things like philosophy or literature and theology. I think next fall I'm doing a seminar class on Russian literature and theology, looking at Anna Karenina from Tolstoy, some of Dostoevsky's novels, and theology. Great school. We get a lot of students from homeschool, from private school, kind of in the same tradition of valuing class liberal arts education, but with multiple majors where people can study whatever they want to study.
Right. And then I have a personal question for you. You said you read Lord of the Rings and, Tolkien's work when you were younger. Growing up, what were the valuable lessons that you were taking away from these books? How were they shaping you as a person?
Oh, man, that's a great question. The first thing I have to say is that Tolkien's works are glorious and beautiful in and of themselves. So before they do any sort of, it's not like they're valuable works of literature because they make us better people. They're valuable works of literature because they're valuable, because they're good. And so one thing I would say is that I delighted in them. I was just so, I thought they were so fun and so inspiring and just loved them. But it's also certainly true that they cultivated in me a deeper imagination and a way of seeing the world as not fundamentally just black and white, but gray, riddling, looking around in the midst, waiting for some new insight to come. I think they made me more appreciative of history. I got into history some because Tolkien helped excite my interest in the medieval period. And so now I love medieval literature. I love medieval history. I actually I went to Harding as an undergraduate and majored in history because I wanted to study history. And I think they contribute to that. Appreciation of poetry and literature, rhymes and critical thinking. All of those kind of things I think played a big role. But also the really profound themes of Tolkien's work are kindness and love and community. And I hope that at my best, those are themes that have characterized my own values and things that I tried to kind of develop as a child and try to instill in my own children and my students today as well.
Well, this has been really, really engaging. I know I learned a few things and it looked like people were having a lot of fun, especially with the riddles. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you for doing this seminar for us. It's been a pleasure having you.
Great. Thank you so much. God bless all of you in your studies and good luck on the test.